8 months pregnant. She'd built her shelter from fallen logs, until the mountain man said, "You don't have to fight alone anymore." Absaroka Mountains, Wyoming Territory, late November, 1887. Winter had come early, heavy and cruel, settling into the high ridges of the Absarokas like a beast determined to devour. The wind howled through the trees with a bitterness that cut deeper than knives, and snow blanketed the forest floor, already knee-deep in places where no path had been cleared. Nancy Wynne braced her shoulder against a fallen log, sweat freezing at her temples. Her breath came in ragged clouds. 8 months pregnant, she moved like a woman whose body had been claimed by exhaustion, but whose spirit refused to lie down. The clearing she had chosen for her shelter was crude, 4 log walls barely held together, gaps wide enough to let the wind howl straight through. The roof was nothing but a canvas tarp, weighted by stones and sagging in the middle. Snow clung to its edges, seeping through the corners like a warning. Nancy dropped the log with a grunt and leaned against the frame, one hand at the small of her back, the other pressing her belly. Her coat hung open, not by choice. She simply could not afford to button it anymore. Her fingers were cracked, split from cold and rope burn. Her lips were purple. Still, she kept moving. She looped a rough length of rope around the next log. Her hands trembled. She cursed softly as the knot slipped. "Damn it," she whispered through chattering teeth. The wind picked up. She pushed her body forward, dragging the log inch by inch toward the wall. She paused to catch her breath. The baby shifted low in her belly, sharp and heavy. Something inside her tightened. She ignored it. As she reached for the timber again, a shadow moved in the tree line, a figure on foot, broad, cloaked in a long fur coat, snow clinging to the hem. He stepped into the clearing without a word, his boots crunching softly. Nancy froze, her hands flying to the axe she kept nearby. The man raised both hands slowly, palms out. His voice was deep, low. "I do not mean you harm." She narrowed her eyes. Her grip on the axe remained. He moved forward, slowly, stopping beside the sagging beam she had tried to raise. With a glance at her swollen belly, he crouched, and with one hand, lifted the log into place. Muscles flexed beneath his coat, quiet and sure. He wedged the beam into its joint atop the wall, adjusting it with practiced ease. Then he stepped back. He did not look her in the eyes. "You are doing fine, ma'am," he said. "I just helped once. You do not owe me anything." She stared at him, breathing hard. Snow clung to her lashes. He gave a slight nod, turned, and walked back into the trees without another word. His footprints trailed behind him, deep and deliberate, swallowed slowly by the falling snow. Nancy stood still for a long time. Then, slowly, she lowered the axe. She leaned against the cabin wall. Her knees buckled slightly. One hand went to her belly again. The baby kicked. Tears stung her eyes, hot against the freezing air. She swallowed them. "I cannot do this alone," she whispered to the wind, "but I cannot trust another man again." Snow whispered against canvas. The clearing fell silent. Nancy closed her eyes, chin trembling. Winter was far from over, and she was still very much alone. The sun crept over the ridge with the hesitance of winter light, pale and cold as bone. Snow had hardened overnight, a crust of ice covering the clearing. Nancy Wynne stirred beneath a thin quilt, breath visible in the morning air. Her belly pressed outward beneath her coat, taut and heavy. She shifted slowly, wincing as her joints ached from the cold. When she opened the cabin door, the world lay silent. And there, in the snow, a rough burlap sack. Nancy stared. No footprints surrounded it, though the wind could have covered them. She stepped forward carefully, her boots crunching over frost. Kneeling slowly, she opened the sack with trembling fingers. Inside, a coil of fresh rope, a tin of lamp oil, a small sack of nails, wrapped in oilcloth, and a wrapped bundle of something dark, thick, and fragrant. Venison, dried and smoked. No note, no mark. Nancy glanced toward the trees. "Is this a joke?" she muttered, voice cracking in the cold. The wind answered, whispering through the pines. She carried the sack inside. That night, she lit the lamp with the oil, fingers hesitant, almost ashamed. She hung the rope by the door. The meat she left untouched for hours, then finally carved a small piece and chewed it slowly, staring at the flames. The next morning, a neat stack of split firewood appeared near the cabin wall. 2 days later, a bundle of roofing shingles. Then a woolen blanket, soft as anything she had ever owned. Nancy stood in the doorway with the blanket clenched in both hands, jaw set. "Stop pitying me," she shouted into the woods. "I do not need saving." Silence. She pressed the blanket to her chest, her hands trembling. Later that week, she rode the borrowed mule into town. Her belly made movement slow and awkward, but she needed flour and salt. At the general store, conversations halted when she entered. Eyes turned. Whispered voices rose behind her back. "She's the one building up on Timber Creek. Heard some mountain man's been leaving her supplies. Strange fellow." Nancy kept her chin high. Her cheeks burned, but she met no one's gaze. Paid with coins she could not afford to lose. Then left. In the trees beyond the ridge, Rowan Pike stood watch. He did not follow. He did not speak. He only made sure she returned safely. Each night, he watched the soft flicker of firelight behind the gaps in her unfinished cabin. His hands bore fresh blisters from the axe. But he never knocked. He remembered too well the face of his fiancée, lost to snow he could not outrun. Remembered the hour he left her alone to fetch firewood, the hour he never forgave himself for. So now, he stayed distant, silent, useful. It was enough, until the wind changed. One night, as the moon vanished behind thick clouds, the mountain wind began to howl. It tore through the clearing like a wild thing, howling between the gaps in Nancy's walls. The canvas roof flapped violently, held only by frayed rope. A high-pitched creaking sound echoed, wood straining. Nancy sat curled in a corner, wrapped in every blanket she owned, her breath catching in her throat. The baby shifted low, heavy, and sharp. The cold seeped in from every direction. Then, a sound. Not wind, metal on wood. She stiffened, hammering. Out on the roof, she crawled to the wall, heart thudding. Through a crack in the log seam, she saw him, Rowan Pike, balanced on the roof like a shadow, bracing himself against the gusts. His coat flared in the wind as he hammered a beam into place, driving new nails into the wood she could not reach. The storm screamed. He did not pause. "Why?" she whispered, forehead pressed to the cold wall. "Are you trying to keep me alive?" The hammering stopped for a breath. Rowan's head turned slightly. He said nothing. Then he lifted the hammer again and kept working. Nancy pressed both hands to her belly. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and bitter. She did not want to need him, but she was not sure she would last the winter without him. The storm did not come with a whisper. It came with a howl. By mid-morning, the peaks of the Absaroka Range were swallowed by dark, bruised clouds. The air had turned electric, sharp with the scent of snow and threat. Nancy Wynne glanced up from the creek as the wind shifted, scattering loose flakes into sudden gusts. She had gone farther than usual, farther than she should have, dragging a small sled behind her, desperate for water and a few more branches of firewood before the storm set in. She knew the signs. Everyone did. But she had waited too long. The wind snapped the trees into motion, whipping the snow sideways. Visibility dropped in minutes. What was once a narrow path became a sea of white. The woods blurred. The sky disappeared. The storm was no longer coming. It was already here. Nancy tightened her coat, pulling the fur lining close around her neck. Her breath came faster, shorter, shallower. The baby pressed low inside her, the weight of it dragging her forward. She stumbled once, then twice, boots skidding in the deepening snow. "Steady," she whispered, as if she could will herself upright. But then the wind roared. and she could no longer tell which direction she had come from. Trees twisted in white shadows. Her knees buckled. She fell to one side, hands sinking into the drift. Her body trembled. She pushed herself up slowly, but another wave of dizziness struck. Her lips were numb, her vision blurred. That was when she saw him. Rowan Pike moved through the storm like it recognized him. Snow clung to his coat, his hat pulled low, scarf wrapped high. He cut through the white wall and reached her in 4 long strides. "You're off the trail," he said, his voice low and certain, even through the wind. Nancy tried to respond, but her throat was raw. He crouched beside her, steadying her with a hand just above her elbow, not touching skin. Never skin. "You need to get back. Now." I lost the path," she whispered, breath catching. "I know. Come on. Breathe." He reached into his coat and pulled out a coiled rope. With quick, practiced hands, he tied one end around her waist, loose enough for comfort, tight enough for safety. The other end, he tied around his own. "Why?" she started. "To keep you from getting lost again." He tightened the knot. "Hold on to me." They began moving, slowly, Rowan leading through the blizzard. Nancy stumbled. He caught her. She slipped again. He pulled her upright, never breaking stride. Behind them, the mule brayed in fear. Rowan turned back once, tied the reins securely to his saddle horn. "He'll follow," he said. The wind screamed. Snow pressed in from all sides. And Rowan did something she did not expect. He pulled open his thick fur-lined coat and wrapped it around her shoulders from behind, sheltering her with his entire body. The cold slammed into his back, but he did not flinch. Nancy, half frozen and dizzy, let herself lean into him. Each step was a battle. The wind tried to turn them back, to bury them. Nancy's legs gave out again, and this time she could not rise. "I can't," she whispered. Rowan looked at her, eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat. Then, without a word, he bent down and lifted her into his arms. She gasped, shocked by the sudden heat of his chest, the strength in his hold. He carried her to the mule, mounted first, then pulled her gently onto the saddle in front of him. One arm wrapped around her back, the other held the reins. He bent his head, shielding her face from the wind with his own body. Her head lolled against his chest. "Why?" she murmured, voice faint. "Why do you keep helping me?" Rowan didn't answer right away. His voice came soft, hoarse. "Because once, there was someone I didn't get to in time." Nancy closed her eyes. And for the first time in weeks, she let someone else carry the weight. The wind still hissed beyond the cabin walls, but the worst of the storm had passed. Snow clung to the windows like frostbitten lace. Inside, the fire flickered low, casting long, swaying shadows across the timber walls. Rowan remained near the door, sitting just beside it, his back against the logs. He did not cross into the center of the room. His presence was quiet, steady, as if he guarded the threshold between the woman and the storm. Nancy sat at the table, bundled in every spare layer she owned. Her body ached, and her baby kicked softly beneath her ribs, reminding her of what was at stake. She watched Rowan through the haze of firelight. "Why are you still here?" He didn't look up. "The storm hasn't gone, just paused to catch its breath." "I mean here, with me." He glanced at her then, and the intensity of his eyes made her breath falter. "Because no one should be alone when it comes back." Silence settled again. Nancy's voice broke it, quiet, but deliberate. "I was married, back east, to a man who told me he loved me." Rowan listened without interrupting. "He convinced me to leave everything, promised we'd build a life in the West. But after we married, he gambled away my dowry, drank through my savings. And when I told him I was pregnant, he panicked. Told my family I'd cheated, lied, that the child wasn't his." She stared at her hands. "They believed him. My father called me a disgrace, said I brought shame on our name. They threw me out, told me to never come back." She gave a bitter laugh. "All my life, They wanted me to marry well, and when I did, it still wasn't enough. Rowan's voice was low. And so you came here, to fight for something of your own? Nancy nodded. To prove I could make a place in the world, even if no one believed I could. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box. He walked slowly to the table and placed it in front of her. Nancy looked down, puzzled. Open it, he said. Inside lay a hand-carved wooden mallet, smooth with age. The handle was worn where fingers had once gripped it for years. She made that, he said. My fiancé. Carved toys for the valley children. That was her favorite tool. Her father gave it to her. Nancy's voice softened. What happened to her? There was a storm, he said simply. I left to check the traps. Told her I'd be gone 10 minutes. He didn't say the rest. Nancy's chest tightened. The avalanche? He nodded. I dug until my hands bled. Never found her. Silence stretched again. Why give this to me? She asked. Because she would have wanted to help you, Rowan replied. And you're building something worth protecting. Nancy swallowed the lump in her throat. Thank you. Just then, 3 sharp knocks shattered the quiet. Rowan stood instantly. Nancy rose, heart pounding. The door creaked open, letting in a gust of icy air, and with it, a man in a polished wool coat, his boots spotless, his gloves too fine for this part of the world. His badge gleamed. Gideon Reeves, he said, Federal Land Inspector. Nancy's voice caught. Can I help you? He stepped in without waiting. His gaze swept the room, pausing on Rowan. His smile turned smug. Well, Reeves said, looks like you're not living alone after all. Nancy's hands flew protectively to her belly. I filed this claim fairly. You filed under the single residency clause, Reeves said. Unassisted development. A man sleeping under your roof violates that. Rowan stepped forward. I do not live here. Reeves ignored him. This claim is now void. It'll be reassigned by spring. Nancy's voice cracked. You can't. Reeves stepped closer, voice low and cruel. You're just a girl playing settler with a hunter by your side. That's not homesteading. That's charity. Nancy's knees nearly buckled. Tears welled as her voice trembled. This land, it's all I have. Rowan moved between them, his hand bracing the doorframe. His voice was ice. You'll take this land over my dead body. Reeves looked at him, eyes narrowing, but he said nothing. He turned on his heel and slammed the door behind him. Nancy sank into the nearest chair, shaking. Rowan didn't move from the door, but for the first time, he stayed inside. The wind never stopped. It clawed at the seams of the cabin, shrieking through the cracks in the timber as if trying to get inside. Snow beat against the walls with unrelenting fury, and the cold crept in from every direction. Nancy lay curled on the bedding of pine boughs and blankets near the fire, her face pale and lips drawn tight. Sweat clung to her brow despite the chill in the room. Her breath came fast, shallow, erratic. It had started just after midnight. A sharp, low pain in her abdomen had woken her with a gasp. She'd tried to convince herself it was nothing, just strain from lifting too much the day before, or a false alarm from the bitter cold. But it was not. She was in labor. 1 month too early. Rowan had seen the look in her eyes. He had not panicked. He had not even spoken much. Instead, he had moved into motion, swift, quiet, prepared like a man who had faced storms, avalanches, and blood before. Only this time, what he was fighting was time itself. He added logs to the fire, poured snow into pots to melt. He checked the gaps in the roof and stuffed wool into every hole he could find. When a sudden gust ripped at the shutters, he grabbed his tools and climbed to reinforce the rafters. Nancy groaned, clutching her belly. Another contraction ripped through her like a blade. Rowan, she gasped. It's too early. I'm not ready. He knelt beside her. You are stronger than you know. She trembled. What if she does not? What if she cannot? Breathe, he said, placing both hands on her shoulders. I will not let you do this alone. The next hour passed in blinding pain. Nancy writhed, clinging to the edge of the bedding, fingers digging into rough fabric. Rowan sat by her side, heating water, wringing cloths, wiping her brow when the fever began to rise. He placed a steadying hand behind her back, with every wave of pain. At one point, she screamed, raw and helpless, and he cupped her face between his calloused palms, their foreheads touching. Breathe with me, he whispered, voice like stone worn soft by years of wind. Match my breath. She did, ragged, sobbing, but she did. When the storm outside grew louder, Rowan added more wood, banking the fire high. He wrapped thick pelts along the cabin walls and spread his coat across the floor where Nancy lay. She was losing strength. Her hands had gone limp. Her legs shook. Rowan knelt again. Nancy. She opened her eyes, barely. I cannot do it. Yes, you can. Her eyes filled with tears. I am so scared. He bent closer, hands cradling her shoulders. You have fought this whole world to protect this child. You've chopped trees and built shelter with your bare hands. You have more courage than any man I have ever known. Tears ran down her cheeks. Rowan's voice broke slightly. You do not need to fight alone anymore. With a final cry, raw from the soul, Nancy pushed. And then, silence. For one breath. Two. A sound followed, wet, sharp, rising into the air. A cry. The cry of a newborn. Rowan's hands trembled as he caught the small, slick body and wrapped it quickly in his heavy wool coat. The firelight flickered over the child's face, tiny and flushed. A girl, he said, barely able to believe his voice. You have a daughter. Nancy collapsed backward, sobbing in exhaustion. Her eyes locked on the baby, and her breath caught. Let me see her, she whispered. Rowan placed the bundle in her arms. The coat dwarfed the child, but her tiny fists reached up, warm and alive. Nancy looked at the baby, then at Rowan. You saved us, she said hoarsely. Rowan knelt beside them, his hands shaking now that the danger had passed. No, he said softly. You saved her. You kept her alive. Nancy turned her face to the firelight, and for the first time in what felt like eternity, she smiled, weak, trembling, but real. Rowan looked down at the baby. The fire glinted in his eyes, and something old, buried deep within him, stirred. It was not fear. It was not sorrow. It was hope. Spring crept into the Absaroka range like a whispered promise. Snow melted in rivulets, the ground softened, and green shoots pushed through soil that had known only frost. The cabin, once barely more than canvas and four walls, now stood strong. Beams held the roof, shutters blocked the wind, and chimney smoke curled upward in steady gray wisps. Each morning, Rowan worked beside Nancy. They rebuilt the fence from salvaged pine. Nancy, with her baby wrapped against her chest, steadied the posts while Rowan hammered. Afternoons were spent tilling soil behind the cabin, planting potatoes and hardy greens. Their rhythm was quiet, easy. Not lovers, not yet, but something close. Nancy had not believed she would ever know peace again. Then Reeves returned. It was the second warmest day of the year. Rowan chopped kindling. Nancy sowed her first potato row. The baby, now 2 months old, slept in a cedar cradle Rowan had carved, its legs etched with tiny stars and leaves. The knock at the gate was loud, intentional, a warning. Gideon Reeves stood there, coated in trail dust, his bowler hat crooked, smile rusted and thin. Behind him waited several men in town, coats and polished boots, badges flashing in the sun. Well, Reeves said, gaze skimming from Rowan to Nancy, did not expect to find this place still standing, let alone growing. Nancy rose, brushing dirt from her hands. What do you want? Reeves pulled a folded document from his coat and shook it open. Your land claim? Seems it was never properly filed. Technically, void. That is false, Nancy replied. Reeves smiled. It is now. Rowan stepped forward, but Nancy lifted a hand. She moved to the gate alone, her shoulders squared. I built this house, she said. I gave birth here. You cannot take it. I am not taking anything, Reeves replied, holding out the paper. Sign this. Walk away, or I enforce removal by law. Nancy's fingers curled at her sides. And if I don't? His voice hardened. Then I remove you by force. Rowan remained just behind her, silent, steady. He carried no weapon, but his stance was clear. He would not let her stand alone. This land is mine, Nancy said again. Reeves' jaw twitched. Then, suddenly, he reached into his coat and drew a revolver. Sign it, he barked, aiming at her chest, or I will. A sharp crunch of boots on gravel cut him off. Rowan stepped between them, hands raised. You will have to shoot me first, he said, voice low. Reeves fired. The crack echoed through the clearing. Birds scattered from the trees. Rowan staggered, blood spreading down his shoulder. Nancy screamed, but he did not fall. He stood tall, jaw clenched, eyes burning. You will not touch her, he growled. Not ever again. From the trees came shouts. Townsfolk emerged, men and women with worried eyes. Among them, the sheriff and a land office clerk. They saw Reeves' smoking gun, Rowan bleeding. Panic erupted. In moments, Reeves was disarmed and restrained, accused of misconduct and assault. The sheriff tore the badge from Reeves' coat and turned to Nancy. We're sorry, he said. Your claim will be reviewed, fully honored. As quiet returned, Nancy dropped beside Rowan, pressing both hands to his shoulder. You're hurt, she whispered. Rowan winced. Worse things have happened. You shouldn't have. I would again, he said softly. Nancy's voice broke. You can't leave us. Rowan looked at her, really looked, and smiled, not the guarded kind she had seen before, but something gentler. I'm not going anywhere, he said. There's too much left to build. The envelope came on a clear April morning, crisp and white against the cabin table's dark wood. Nancy opened it with steady fingers, though her heart trembled. Inside was a document bearing the official stamp of the Wyoming Territory, confirmation of her legal and permanent ownership of the land. She stared at it for a long moment, then set it beside Clara's cradle. The land was hers, not by charity, not by inheritance. She had fought for it, with blood, resolve, and help she had once feared to accept. Outside, spring touched the mountains in golden light. Snowmelt rushed down the creek. Wildflowers bloomed, and birds sang from budding branches. Rowan was near the barn, fitting cedar planks together. The scent of shaved wood hung in the air. He was building something new, a cradle. Not the rough box they had used through winter, but a polished piece of craftsmanship. The rails were smooth, hand-sanded. Along the edge, Rowan had carved stars and pine needles, using a chisel once owned by his late fiancée. Nancy came to stand beside him. Clara swaddled close, in a sling across her chest. Rowan glanced at her, then back to the cradle. She deserves more than what we gave her during the storm. Nancy smiled. You made this beautiful. I wanted her to have something peaceful, he said softly. That afternoon, they placed it beneath the window, where light pooled across the floor. Clara slept soundly inside. Her tiny fist curled into a blanket Nancy had sewn during sleepless nights. Spring deepened. Their rhythm changed. Together, they reinforced the awning with thick beams. Rowan dug a well beside the apple tree, while Nancy hauled water. They cleared brambles and tilled new earth, planting rows of potatoes, squash, and onions. One morning, Rowan knelt beside Clara, letting her wrap her fingers around his. Her grip surprised him. Nancy leaned in the doorway, watching. His hands made for wilderness, held her daughter with such care, it stilled her heart. She's strong, he said, smiling up at her. She gets that from both sides, Nancy replied. That evening, Rowan moved to lift Clara from her cradle, then paused. "May I?" he asked. Nancy froze. Her heart caught in her chest. No man had ever asked before. Not her father, not Thomas. Just Rowan. Always gentle, always waiting. "Yes," she whispered. He lifted Clara with both hands, cradling her close. The baby made a small sound and nuzzled into his chest. Nancy watched them. Her walls, once made of steel and fear, softened. In the days that followed, a steadier life bloomed. They shared meals, planted herbs in pots, mended clothes by firelight, while Clara cooed nearby. Rowan never presumed, never pushed. He listened. He showed up. Nancy grew to love the quiet strength of him, his stillness, his patience, his way of leaving space instead of trying to fill it. One breezy afternoon, as petals scattered across the yard, she said quietly, "You never tried to take anything from me." Rowan didn't look away. "I never will." That night, she tucked Clara into her cradle and stood at the window. The moon hung low over the hills. On the porch, Rowan carved a small wooden horse, whittling by lantern light. Nancy stepped outside, shawl drawn around her shoulders, and sat beside him. The air was cool and clean. Neither spoke. Then she reached out, hand trembling, and laid it gently over his. Rowan paused, turned his palm upward, let their fingers twine. It wasn't a beginning. It was a choice. Made quietly, made together, under the stars. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The light filtered through pine needles and flickered on the face of the nearly finished cabin. It stood strong now, no longer a makeshift shelter, but a home. The timber was secure, the roof slanted just right to repel mountain storms, and a chimney sent a thin trail of smoke into the spring air. Nancy stood on a wooden beam, hammer in hand, while Rowan held the final support post in place. The sound of wood meeting iron echoed, steady and sure. "There," she said, breathing hard but smiling. "The last one." Rowan didn't move for a moment. He just looked up at the cabin, then at her. She saw the flicker in his eyes, the way he had looked at the mountains after every long climb, searching for something more than just the view. As the light dimmed, they stepped down onto solid earth. Clara babbled from her blanket on the porch, her little fists waving in the air. Rowan bent to pick up a dropped tool, but his movements were slower than usual, thoughtful. He glanced toward the cabin, then to Nancy. "I've been thinking." She raised an eyebrow, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "That's usually dangerous." He gave a small smile, then said, "You and Clara. You have your land, your home. You do not need anyone. But if there's room for one more set of hands, someone to help with the planting, the repairs, or to rock Clara to sleep when your arms are tired." He paused, then added, quietly, "I'll be here, if you choose me." Nancy stared at him, heartbeat loud in her ears. There was no pressure in his voice, no demand, no claim, just a man standing with open hands and honest eyes. She stepped closer, holding Clara against her chest. The baby's warmth seeped into her ribs. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees, brushing past them like a quiet witness. Nancy looked at Rowan, not as the man who had saved her, or even the one who had stood between her and Reeves' gun, but as someone who had given her space to breathe again, and who had waited, patiently, for her to find the words. She reached out and took his calloused hand in hers. "Not because I need you," she said, her voice steady, "but because I choose you." Rowan's breath caught. He lowered his forehead to touch hers, gently, reverently. It was a gesture without words, but full of meaning, a mountain man's vow, silent but unbreakable. Clara giggled in her mother's arms, reaching out her chubby hands to them both. The door to the cabin creaked open behind them, letting the last of the sunlight spill across the threshold. Nancy led the way inside, Rowan close behind, and Clara nestled between them. The cabin glowed golden with the firelight. Pots hung from hooks, the cradle rocked gently, and the smell of pine resin and warm bread filled the air. The wind outside no longer howled. It whispered. And on that piece of wild land, carved out of hardship and resilience, love did not come crashing in like a storm. It came like spring, quiet, patient, chosen. Because the strongest people were not the ones who faced the storm alone, but the ones who learned to let someone face it with them. Thank you for riding with us through this breathtaking frontier of survival, strength, and second chances. Nancy and Rowan's story wasn't just about building a cabin. It was about building trust, healing from the past, and choosing love when it's hardest to believe in it. If this story touched your heart, made you tear up, or just gave you hope that even in the harshest wilderness, love can still find its way, don't forget to hit that hype button to show your support. And if you want more emotional, slow-burn Western romances like this one, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories so you never miss the next tale of resilience, redemption, and real love. We'll see you on the next ride down the dusty trail.